priest, and I didn't retire from being a priest, but I retired from being the pastor of that parish. So my friend aptly described it. He said, you missed the action, but not all the administration of it, as well. I think that's absolutely true, too. So since we have the cross in the center of the church for this Holy Week, third week of Great Lent, I thought that I would talk a little bit about just some dimensions of the cross and that. So it's so prevalent in all of our lives, in the life of the church, right? I mean, everything from being on your vestments to being on about everything, that's visible in the life of the church. And everything enters into paradise through the cross. There's no other means for that. So every baptismal blessing of the water, everything is always with the image of the sign of the cross. And of course, as you know, we make our hands into the Jesus Christ, and then we make the cross up, or whatever it is that we're going to bless. So it's so prevalent in the hymnology in the life of the church on this feast is, last week in the feast, the second week of Lent with St. Gregory Palamas, and the fourth, you get a lot of the texts that talk about, our Lenten mission to come through and kind of fight the sins within us. And then in the midst of all this, there's this beautiful hymnography on the cross, and you all know, if you've listened to it, that the images are just unbelievably beautiful. Addressing the cross, we implore the cross, and we're constantly mentioning it as the life-giving cross, the entrance and door to paradise, and all of the kind of imagery and poetry of the church. And so there was a Russian priest, and he said, are we worshipers of a tree? Is that what we're doing? Or he says, are we praying actually to a tree when we say, oh, invincible, ineffable, life-giving cross? Are we praying to the tree? And he answered us, he said, the cross is buried from all eternity in the bosom of the Holy Trinity. And he made the point, my wife kind of disagreed with it a little bit. She said, but he made the point that, the cross is this vertical dimension, and then he said it's like an image of the Trinity. So the Father and then the Holy Spirit and the Son are moving towards the center, which is the heart of the Trinity, the love of the Trinity. And my wife said, yeah, but that's one member like that. So I said, no, I think you can envision that this circumcision of love in the Holy Trinity is a constant movement of self-giving and love within the Trinity. And at the heart of that, before God ever makes a blade of grass, he knows that his Son is going to be incarnate and carry the cross for us. So we're not praying to a tree, because at the heart of the Trinity and love is the image and the emblem of the cross by which the Son of God would offer himself for us and for our salvation. So it's a beautiful image then, and that, I think, speaks to us why we kind of personify the cross. Why we say, oh, invincible, life-giving cross, because it's an image of that perpetual and eternal love of God. And that isn't just an earthly event. It isn't just when Christ is raised on the cross and crucified for us. It's in the pre-eternal plan of God, that God would send his Son in order for us to be saved. So that image of the cross is, you could say, as Bulgakov does, that then that's the heavenly cross. That's the cross from all eternity, the sign and the image of heaven itself, and the image and intent of God to show his love for us through that incredible sacrifice and suffering of love that he does. He speaks of the heavenly cross, Bulgakov does, that the cross was buried in the bosom of the love of the Holy Trinity, the ultimate sign in the heavens. It's the sacrificial love of God, the surrender of himself for the sake of the other. First of all, in that inner love of the Trinity in the three members, but then also in us as the object of God's love. The cross of love is buried also prevailingly in all of the salvation history of the people of God. The tree of life with its fruit in Jesus Christ in the garden, within reach. The wood of Noah's ark, the upheld and outstretched arms of Moses when he was defeating the pagan peoples of the promised land, before they entered. It says that he prevailed in the battle when two of his servants upheld his arms in the form of a cross. The rod that struck the sea in Moses' wood, the branch that sweetened the waters of Marah when they were bitter, and the wood of a bush was thrown in there. The thicket in which Abraham's ram is caught, the wood in the sacrifices that burned them, the crossing of the Red Sea and the Jordan, because the people crossed and the river was running that way, so their very crossing was in the image and sign of a cross. All showing the heavenly sign buried in love in the bosom of the Trinity and made sure in its mounting by the incarnate Son of God. It's also our life, and in personifying it with our hymns, we are but reflecting its preordination as a sign of salvation, perfectly reflecting the surrender of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in the sacrifice of love. So, we often talk about and associate the cross with suffering as well. We say, okay, we have to carry our cross, and that's the adversities, the sufferings, and the difficulties of life. But one very good theologian once said, we should not speak of suffering. We should speak of love instead. So he gave this image, which I thought was really good. It's Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. He said, when a nanny stays up all night with your child, it's suffering. When a mother stays up all night with the child, it's love, right? So we should never kind of feel ourselves in the shortcomings of sufferings, because the cross is ultimately the measure of love. God commends his love for us in this. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us as well. So, of course, the cross itself includes oftentimes some challenge or some suffering that we undergo. It's the bitter medicine, St. Nikolai says, that we have to endure. The taste of the medicine is usually bitter as well, but it is sweetened in the context of love. And once a person, as St. Maximus says, has understood the cross and the empty tomb, they've understood all the mysteries of the Christian faith as well. That God in his intent, carries this cross and then invites us also to share in his cross, to share in his love, to have that sacrifice of the cross in the center of our hearts so that we're capable of a greater and greater love. And this is something, of course, that we're encouraged by St. Paul the Apostle when he says, our heart is enlarged towards you, Corinthians. Enlarge your heart towards us. So it's not just the measure of everything, it's the object, because in the beloved there's always the object, and we are ultimately living in this relationship of communion with others. And so the cross of Christ empowers us with the sacrificial love of God, the energies of that love. We pray for God's energy of love to come to us, and then we reflect that love and let it pass through us to the other. That energy is God's. God is love, ultimately. Incidentally, if we're monotheists, which we are, without the Trinity, St. Gregory Nazianzus said, a God who didn't have a son would be a monster. So love is not just the communion and the disposition of an emotion, but is the communion of persons. So God made it ultimately so that we can't really see our face, right? We don't see our face unless we want to stand around in front of a mirror. But he says we see our face reflected in the other person. And there's one theologian in the Greek church that said the word prosopon, the word for person, he thought that that was prosopsis, or towards the eyes. I don't know whether the etymology is exactly correct. It certainly stands the test, because those words are Greek words that are combined there. But in the eyes, of course, is reflected for us the impact that we have on other people, right? And we have that kind of sense of wonder in the person. Metropolitan Kallistos once said, it's so sad when in a marriage the sense of wonder is lost, You remember, Al, when you're dating that person, how enthralled that you are, and how much that person, is the person that you just want to spend all the time with. Of course, St. Gregory also said, the dyad or two isn't good. You need three so that we're not just preoccupied with the two, so that that love can extend itself out farther as well. So he said three is kind of the number of communion, as well. When you're kids, and you go through that exclusion of friends or something like that, you're kind of outside that circle trying to make your way in, as well. And a lot of the times, if two people are preoccupied, it's kind of exclusive, But three, the number of communion within the Trinity, is that invitation into that greater communion of just the dyad, the two, into that. And of course, that is exactly us. We are a multiplicity of persons within one nature. And that's what makes love a capacity for each one of us as well. So there's a passage in the Philokalia from St. Mark the Ascetic. And here's the sentence, the way it reads. It says, while a man can scarcely keep what belongs to him by nature, Christ gives the grace of sonship through the cross. Let's explore that just a little bit. Sometimes it's not easy to understand the inconstancy of the nature that we're born with, that was given to us, that we inherited with our coming into this world. If we measure things the wrong way and don't understand this mystery, the need of nature to be saved and transformed, we might look at our lives as if they're always in the black and not in the red, for reasons no deeper than that the things in this world, the temporal life, are going well. But the gifts in this world, and they are gifts, that the world affords us through God's blessing, they can't be grasped with any finality. One could say that they're fluid like water. I mean, we can hold a small portion of water in the palm of our hand temporarily and briefly, but if it rests in our palm and we try to squeeze it, it just escapes all that much faster. So, I gave 3 lectures. The first one, and I started feeling guilty when I come here to St. Barbara's, because in the first one, I said that those who don't learn how to pray are perpetual losers who have no chance of success in life. In the second lecture, I told you that St. Paisios said that the more spiritual we become, the fewer rights we have in this life. And in the third lecture, which I allude to in this little talk, is I said that St. Paul gives us 3 zeros. Our existence, we're 0. Our knowledge without God, we're 0. Our possessions, they're all gifts, we're 0 as well. So I guess I called you unsuccessful losers who are 0, in these last 3 lectures. But of course, the secret to all of that is that besides the zeros, like in computers, there are ones. And the bad thing about, making 0, other than it actually is, and this is why love counts so much, is because when we make ourselves the 1 and we make others the 0, of course we have it inverted. In the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, you have these words where Christ says he wanted to teach people through the parable of the Pharisee and the publican He says he wanted to teach those who trust in their own righteousness and despise others. So, and that Greek word, right, exothendos, it has the root of ουδέν, which means nothing, right? So whenever we're in a position where we're the one and everybody else around is the zero, then we have the principle of spiritual life inverted, So even where God is concerned, all of that zero, St. Paul says to the Galatians, he said, if any man thinks he is something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So that word, when he is miden, right? When he is zero, he deceives himself. St. Paul says about knowledge, and this is really important for us because we're living in an information society and not really cognizant of what true knowledge can do. So St. Paul says, if anyone thinks that he knows something, he knows nothing as he ought to know it as well. So, and that's, he doesn't know, a single thing, as well, a zero. So our existence is a gift, right? So we meet God at the juncture of zero, and God gives us the blessings of life, right? And when we're able to hold that thought in our hearts and souls that we're meeting him at that point of zero, then we have the sense of gratitude and love and wonder. So first in our existence, he says, miden, zero, and we deceive ourselves when we really count as if we're self-existent or that we have it all in control. That our knowledge, he says, if we think we know something, then we really know nothing as we ought to know. So we have to almost have a kind of ignorance in the Christian faith, not because we don't have the brain capacity to know something, but because true knowledge is not just information. It's communion, it's experience, right? So we all know that even in the Old Testament, that the verb Adam knew Eve, and she conceived and bare a child, as well. It's communion that knowledge is in. So in the information society, of course, you have a lot of kind of information that's passed around and circulated. So one Greek writer said, we've drifted from the sense and the dread of what true knowledge is. He said, in the garden, knowledge was able to bring us to the very brink of non-existence through the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We've lost that sense of dread for what true knowledge is. We don't understand the power of true knowledge as well. This Greek writer says, therefore, we're a bit like the cow chewing its cud, with this information that constantly is flowing into us. And he makes the point that, generally speaking, there's not one really substantial thing that's conveyed in all of this information that we have as well. It's just the exchange of terabytes of knowledge and knowledge and knowledge, but it isn't what knowledge is. St. Paul, they say, kind of created the word epignosis. He added that prefix to gnosis, or to knowledge, in order to kind of intensify it and say there's a kind of abundant knowledge, an overflowing knowledge. Well, that's why they say that in the spiritual life that one knows with their nous, with the center part of their spirit. It's kind of communion with God as well. So one thing that we do know as saving knowledge is that we can't grasp this nature of ours with any finality. So St. Mark says that while we can scarcely keep what is given to us by nature, God gives us the gift of sonship through the cross. Nature is like that. From that vantage point, that we cannot hold with any finality the things that this world gives to us. They're blessings from God for sure, as well. But they are passing in time, right? And time, if you get even as old as I am, you realize, that at some point early on, you're gathering. And then at some point, you start giving it all back, ultimately to God, So, because God is the one who possesses everything, and he blesses us to be just stewards of that thing, to carry it. And what we're supposed to make of all that is love. We're supposed to turn all of these blessings into love. We were talking a little bit about the water project in Tanzania, so how we can use our energy, to turn something as simple as that into a loving act, with other people, to be that kind of inclusive people, to have prosopsis towards the eyes of the other, to be in communion, with the other person. So that third zero, he says, having everything but possessing me then nothing, St. Paul. So he doesn't mean that we're not stewarded with these gifts. He means that you cannot, like the saints of the church, they're always in prayer with an open palm, You don't feel tight-fisted around something like that. So the harder that we squeeze, the more that object becomes a preoccupation with us. We can, as Metropolitan Anthony says, when you're holding something tightly in both hands, there's no room to accept anything else. Both hands are preoccupied, and there's nothing more that you can do in order to receive in that moment, as well. So one has to be, in that sense, that things are passing through them, as stewards of those good things. It's easy for us to do with our kids, That's no problem to do with our children. But St. Maximus says, that in the partiality, and he names a number of things. He says, if your love only goes as far as your own family, your love isn't perfect. He says, if it goes as far as your own nation, your love isn't perfect. He says that ultimately, the love has to include everyone. And this is why love and the capacity of the cross is a stretching out to all mankind to gather them in, as well. I said that Bulgakov thought also, that even our very creation, because we have two arms, the cross is in that. We have the vertical and we have the two arms. And basically, when we use those two arms generally, and they're not outstretched in this way, generally they're like, hey, come here, honey, come on, I'll get you, as well. Our arms are stretched out ultimately in an act of love towards the other person. That carries the cross, within it itself. So ultimately, all of this is a gift as well, and ultimately, when a person understands that mystery of the cross and the power of the cross. I was listening to Father Tom Hopko today, and he was talking about that first chapter of Corinthians where he says to the Greeks that it's foolishness, and to the Jews it's a scandalon, because he says the Jewish people were looking essentially for, the signs of God. They were accustomed to the parting of the Red Sea, and that's why the Messiah remained an enigma to them as a suffering servant, because they expected the Messiah to come and to rectify things and to exalt the promises. But those promises weren't just for this promised land that they crossed into. That was an image of heaven itself. The promised land is something that we're supposed to pass from life in through death. So the cross becomes obviously an image of death, but in the dying to things, to our own will in that, then ultimately the emergence of the life of God comes in place of that as well. So it's difficult for us, I know, and the kind of horrors of this world, the suffering of this world, can be really grave and scandalous to us. It can really be a scandal, when you hear some a person who's abused children or something like that, your heart just sinks so much, as well, but it's not the end of the story as well, and God is just, so God sees, ultimately the heaviness of the crosses that we bear in life as well. We just have to be with one another and to help all that we can. So if I leave anything with you this evening, certainly I want to leave that image of the heavenly cross that's in the heart of God, his willingness to surrender to love and to endure, the cross for us. And then, the sense of what gain and loss is in life, really. I mean, the only things that we really gain that are perpetual and eternal are the spiritual values, as well. And those generally involve some kind of sacrifice in order to really gain them or to hold on to them. The elder Ephraim from Philotheu once wrote in a book, he said, when we get to heaven, we won't see anything cheap there. There's nothing cheap in heaven. It all is something that was bought by some kind of self-offering in some way as well, right? And this sense of loss, that we have, I'll just close with this, that gain and loss, kerdos in Greek, in St. Paul, who was the apostle of the cross, right? God forbid that I should glory in anything save the cross of Jesus Christ, by which I'm crucified to the world to me, as well. He has that same thing carries over in kind of waiting upon that word of the cross in gain for him. So in the Philippians chapter, there's this marvelous thoughts of St. Paul about where he came from as a Pharisee of Pharisees and so on and so forth. And then he says, to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Who says that? I mean, that they want to die and that will be ultimately the gain. And then he says, for whom the excellency of Christ, I've suffered the loss of everything. And then he even goes further and says, and I count all that as refuse when it's compared to the excellency of Christ. And then he says, ultimately, that he wants to know the power of the resurrection, but then he wants to know, he says, the koinonia, the fellowship of his sufferings. And St. Paul obviously was a person who suffered a lot, for Jesus Christ. He suffered a lot for the Lord as well. And he says that fellowship of sufferings in Christ, he even puts it as far as to say that in his own case, he said, we do our part to fill up the measure of what lacks in the sufferings of Christ. So still today, those sufferings go on, and you have the sense of kind of the world as a vessel, and everybody, all of the kind of measures that are good suffering, are going in there in connection with the suffering of the eternal Son of God. So there's a measure of that in each of our lives as well. And he said, I bear in my body the brands of Jesus Christ, the marks of Jesus Christ. Stigmata in Greek, is what it is, And maybe not many of us bear those brands, in the proper sense of being beaten with whips and all of that kind of stuff. But, in our own way, we try to serve love, and a lot of the times serving of love means that there are wounds involved, especially in this world. To love is to sacrifice, and to love often is misunderstood as well. When I was talking to my wife on the way down, I said, see that right there? That store from Ethiopia is a brand, because I was working in Ethiopia and I cut myself with a saw, so a little bit. And there in Ethiopia, I remember that the abbot of the monastery, came over, to visit Ziggy's incredible work, this Ethiopian woman that came from our parish, and the incredible thing that he did, as she did for all those years, putting kids in school and helping invalids and doing all kinds of stuff like that. You guys and our parish joined one time to do a joint fundraiser with the Chris Hillman concert, many years ago, and allowed those proceeds to go to these two incredible works in Tanzania and Ethiopia, But I'll never forget, that the abbot came from the monastery, and we were helping them as Ethiopian people, and he was like, he took my hand, he was like, oh, I was like, oh no, germs, kind of thing, as well. But that little mark there, even though it wasn't me getting nailed to a cross or something like that, I was over there trying to help with love for other people. And when you're in the kitchen there and you burn your finger or something like that, if we're there and we're doing it for love, then all of us have little marks of love, within us. Whether or not they're actually scars or not, whenever we're acting in love, whenever we're following the way of the cross, not only is the act of the cross there, but there's always a corresponding resurrection. So I always say to people, 1,000 crosses and 1,001 resurrections, because every act of love in the will has a corresponding resurrection to it. And when we feel the power and the might and the wisdom of the cross, then more and more we're conformed to that image of the cross. St. Paul reached the point where he said, I determined to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. So God bless you all on this feast of the cross, and may it be that we always are glorying in the cross of the Lord, by which the world is crucified to us and us to the world. For what? Not just for suffering, but for love. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God bless you all. Sure, if there are any. I was quoting a lot of really smarter people than me, so they're not here tonight, but I'll do my best. What's it?
We know nothing.
We know nothing. I had one person at least listening, right? Yeah.
One was a comment, one was a question, but I always thought it was so interesting how the Romans used the cross as humiliation, but then of course Jesus goes and puts that on his head. But I was also wondering, the Passover, the very first one where they put the blood on the doorpost, was that also like an early cross?
Yeah, for sure, the power and the grace of sacrifice, in the Old Testament was the animals, but of course it was ultimately the image of God's once and for all sacrifice of Christ. Yeah, I don't know that they did it before the cross. A few times you have like the blessing of the 12 patriarchs, it says Jacob crossed his hands to offer the blessing. So all through the Old Testament, it's definitely that God, because it was in his heart for all eternity, you see winding through all of that Old Testament, the power of the wood and of the cross as well. So, yeah, it's all there. Yeah.
I was going to say, it's more palatable to me when I hear that the cross means more than suffering, because when I see it only as suffering, it's like, why do I want to review it? Why do I want to do any? They can't hear. My voice is a little hoarse for some reason. I was saying it's more palatable to me when I hear that the cross means more than just suffering, but also means love, as you express. Because just the expression of suffering doesn't make me feel like I want to revere it,
Right.
kiss
right.
it,
Right.
But what you said makes more sense, and I'm sure Father.
There's a really great, on the internet you can find it, it's Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. He was interviewed by the BBC, and the subject was suffering. And he said, is suffering blessed in itself? And he said, no, suffering can be actually cursed and really drive a person in the wrong direction. He said, its suffering is blessed when it's united to love, And that's where, like I was saying to you, isn't that a good image? That was his image about the woman, the nanny. It's suffering for her to stay up all night. But for the mother, all she cares about is that child. She loves the child. So it's not really, of course she's tired, and of course her body, like anybody else who's staying up with a sick child is tired, but she just doesn't look at it that way because she has the capacity of love within her as well. And when, one kind of enters the mystery of the cross like that, then ultimately one sees it's the power of God's love, ultimately. And that's what changes, I think, it from simply this, kind of curse of suffering, as well, to something that has, as Metropolitan Anthony says in that talk, a redemptive quality about it. It has the capacity to afford a real contact with God, because ultimately God is the one who on the cross kind of rectifies the curse of things and makes it a blessing by bearing it for us. Anybody else? No?
That doesn't mean that Father never explained it before.
No,
Sure he did, I just probably didn't get it.
You know, we're all, I always think about this talk from Father Roman Braga, who silently, and Father Hopko's talk today, talked about silence, that you're never going to hear the word of God and the word of cross if you can't be silent, as well. And Father Hopko, of course, always used to tease about, oh, I'm going to be in trouble when I get to heaven for all the talks and all the lectures and all of that kind of thing, ultimately, but I think he's right, that very often in life, it's not just kind of explaining it. There was a Russian, philosopher, I think it was Berjayev, that said, suffering can never be understood. It could only be accepted, embraced, and transfigured as well. So it's not something, if you say why, and I don't mean blind faith in the sense that, that you don't pray and ask God for some direction when we're going through challenging suffering, but ultimately when you say why, he points to his son on the cross there as well. And that answers for us, because you see the exceeding love of God, then you realize that, God saw, as we say in the baptismal prayers, he did not want us to be subject to the devil and to this curse olive. So he came down from heaven to the earth. So that's obviously even in his descent, it's the first form of the divine form of love in those two measures. And then of course the cross, member, is our human experience and our history that we have to carry as our cross, in that sense.
But suffering can bring you closer to God too.
Definitely. If it's embraced, because nothing can really be transfigured that isn't accepted, right? That's always kind of the problem, as well, that you can't really get on with kind of penetrating its mystery and all of that until some degree or another you let down your guard and say, God is wise, I'm carrying this cross here. There must be some reason of love from God within it. And that's hard to see sometimes when you at some of the terrible suffering
when you're in it.
Within this world, and especially when you're in it. It's hard, if your spouse is sick, or if your child is going through drugs or so. It's very hard to see that as well. And that's where the silence comes in, because there has to be that kind of thing beyond the words, something that's greater than just the words of explanation. But you're right, of course,
Paul, he was suffering.
What's that?
Paul, the apostle,
Yeah.
he was suffering. He
Yeah.
has something, and he asked the Lord to take him. He says, no, I did enough for you.
That's a whole nother talk. In your weakness, my weakness, God's power is made known. That's what St. Paul says. But yeah, he was a living wound. Yeah.
Right.
And that was just his body. Then he said, I have all the anguish of the churches. Who's not scandalized that I'm not angered? Who's not, he mentioned carrying all of the concern for all of those spiritual children, within his heart. So it was both his soul and, like us, our souls, our minds, our hearts, I think Elder Zacharias once said, that he said, you can think about a lot of things when you laugh. He said, but when you cry, you're only thinking about one thing, generally. You can only think about one thing when you're crying, for sure, as well. And that's where that meeting point comes, where we're able to connect that somehow to God. To say not glibly, but all things work together for God, who loved us and called us according to his person. But yeah, nobody wants, and even friends, aren't they just quiet and sit by their friend when they're going through some terrible thing? Yeah, they don't want to try to explain it to them or cast it away or anything. You just are with the person with love when they're going through difficult times. Silence and love. Which is a good thing for me to do right now, be quiet.
Right. Well, thank you again very much.
It's our joy to be here every